Hello everybody and welcome to The View from the Top. We are live. Hi there to Anders coming in from New York. People are coming from all over the world. Pat, who's backstage with us in Boston. Adam from Utah. We got Rafi from the UK. People coming in from all over the world. We have got such an important subject today. I'm so delighted and honoured that we're dealing with this subject. We're going to be talking about moving with pride. So we've got a special episode with a real focus on the LGBTQI community. And it's such an important issue that I think just hasn't had the focus that it really should have. And I've got some great people in the audience today, and more about that in a moment. But we're with the whole show from an immigration point of view, a tax point of view, and of course from a relocation point of view, is 100% focused on this really important subject of moving with pride. So everybody, you know how it works. Join the conversation, write in the comments box. Loads of you doing it there at the moment. I see, gosh, dozens and dozens of you coming in from all over the world. So we want to know who you are, where you are. And as the conversation gets going, please let us know your views. So tell us what you're thinking about stuff. Tell us your opinions. And also, of course, you know, if you hear something that you like, hit that heart button, hit the like button, hit the applause button. So as I said, we've got a great show for you today. And then next week, we've got another interesting show. We've got a show on improving employee experience. And all the surveys that we see say employee experience is a real key criteria for the success of any assignee or business travel program. So that's next week. We're delighted we've got Ramesh Phillips with us next week to talk about improving employee experience. Well, not only is this the best and the biggest show in the global mobility community, but also you can get credits for it. So if you want your credits, if you need credits from ERC, then the credits are there. If you want credits from SHRM, or you want your HRCI credits, they're there. If you want those credits, then just jot down that number now that's coming up there, or indeed get your camera out, take a photo of it as it goes across, or just screenshot it, however you want to do it. Just make sure you get those. I'll leave those codes up there for a moment. The other thing, of course, every week that we try and do is give you what is latest in the breaking news in our industry. What's happened in the last 7 days? Who's moved job? What other news there is? Who's been promoted? Who's won awards? So let's just do that now. Let's just see. We always have a minute of breaking news. So let's see what's been happening in the last 7 days in the wonderful world of global mobility. So congratulations to everybody who's moved, who's won awards on work anniversaries. And I suppose picking up a few of those ones there, a big shout out to Russ Haney, who's joined us at Benevo just the other day. And also a big shout out to John Raisin, who I think I saw earlier is in the audience, for winning his Lifetime Achievement Award for outstanding contribution to global mobility. Very well. And indeed to all the FEM Emma winners. And of course, I suppose I must single out Benevo and Vialto Partners for the work that they've done on smart cost estimates, and indeed to Ray Rackham for winning Global Mobility Professional of the Year. But of course, everybody else who's won Emma Awards as well. Too many to mention. So let's dive straight into this subject. And of course, when you're talking about moving with pride, one of the first issues that comes up are some of the immigration issues. And who better to tell us about some of the immigration issues surrounding LGBTQ plus mobility than our one and only, the great Julia Onslow-Cole. Hey, Julia, how are you doing? You're on mute, actually, Julia, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Right, okay. An old pro like you, Julia. There we go. You're in Singapore, and I think you've been celebrating the 20th anniversary. Is that right?
Yes, Fragomen's office here. Yeah.
I hope this isn't because you've had a few drinks, and I know it's midnight where you're now.
I've been very, very restrained. Just been drinking water all night.
Okay, well, I believe you. So tell us, Julia, this is such an important subject. Let's dive straight in.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to Raj Naik, because he's a partner in London. He's given me a lot of help recently. But sadly, the position from an immigration perspective is that immigration has been extremely slow to follow social pressure for progressive views. And I did check in the last 24 hours before the show, and out of 126 countries, only 48, which is 38%, recognize same-sex spouses or partners in immigration applications. And since 2019, only 2 countries in the whole world since 2019 have added benefits for same-sex spouses or partners in immigration applications, and that's Angola and Hungary. So I think this number will definitely increase over the next 5 years as LGBTQI+ rights expand across the world. And frankly, global governments have to realize that the amount of foreign talent in their country could be really affected, or is being affected, by negative policies towards partners and spouses. And if you look at countries across the world, the global acceptance of same-sex marriages, it varies really widely. And what you could do is you can actually group those countries into 4. So the first group is those countries that actually have laws which grant same-sex couples civil unions or legally recognized marriages. The second big bucket is countries that don't recognize marriages or unions, but generally accept same-sex unions. And then the third bucket is countries where same-sex relation is not officially criminalized, but it's not culturally acceptable. And then the fourth bucket is where it's not only not culturally acceptable, but it's actually illegal. Yeah. Now, generally, if you're a same-sex traveler and you're going to countries in these first 2 buckets, you'll be okay. But in the third category, where it's not culturally acceptable, often members of same-sex marriages choose not to declare their marriages because they want to avoid attention. And this can cause a real dilemma on their visa application form, because there is an obligation to answer the form truthfully.
So what you're saying is that someone might be married, but
yes,
when they're applying for their visa, they simply say they're not married.
Yes.
Which causes its own problems, because they're effectively lying on the form.
And then the fourth category is where it's actually illegal, and it could have very serious consequences, like the Cameroon, Uganda, and it's a serious threat to someone's security. And although I can't say I've got any evidence that governments go and they check these visa applications and they look and seek out things like this, there is always that concern, and that is a concern. I then wanted to just say a few words about the rise of the number of countries that are actually allowing people to have a third gender option in their passport by putting an X. So there are countries which have adopted this policy, and normally it would allow a transgender applicant to self-select, as male or female, and it removes the requirement to provide any medical documentation if their gender doesn't match their other identification. So it also permits people to just opt out of saying anything and just putting an X. Now, the problem is that the difficulty about this, and I was saying it to Brian and everyone before the show, that interestingly enough, when I went to the Singapore office to work yesterday, one of the partners had one of these cases. because Australia was the first country to adopt this. And then in April this year, the US followed suit. But the US for a US passport, you could put X, but then the person entered Singapore, and then the border systems and the whole process sort of didn't recognize this. And so then, we went back to the US authorities and said, well, can we have some more, information to help the situation? And they've been quite slow to provide it.
Can this apply not just in your end country, but even if you're transiting?
Yes. Yeah.
So someone going to Australia transiting through Singapore or Dubai or somewhere?
Yeah. Because the border management systems and the agencies and all the passport screening systems, they just don't recognize, nearly all of them wouldn't recognize an X marker.
Okay, so that's an important point for mobility managers out there, is it's not just a question of looking at the end destination where the person is traveling to, but you've got to look at the route as well.
Definitely. So, all of this means that if you're trans or non-binary, you have to sort of try and develop strategies when you're traveling. And it's really awful because you will have a very big feeling of exposure and a high degree of anxiety and stress. And there's this excellent article by Dr. Quinion from the University of Melbourne, which talks about the X markers in the passport and the impact, and is saying that it's an enormous challenge for those that don't conform to gender norms, and holding a passport that doesn't accurately reflect your gender, your name, your gender marker, it can cause these significant problems, and it really makes it very, very difficult for traveling. Now, there is one country that has sort of really gone the extra mile, and that's Malta, because what they do is you're allowed to select your X option in your main passport, but they'll also give you a second passport, which actually has a male or female, and that's for security and safety reasons. So that's really positive, and that's helpful. But there's so much more that needs to be done, so much more. And it's just.
So I think we're going to have. We need to move on.
Brian.
What else? I was just going to say, we will come back to this subject. Yeah. This is such an important subject. We've got such a packed show today. We're definitely going to come back to this subject. But do finish up, Julia.
Yeah, I just really all wanted to say is that, employers have to give so much support. And just back to what you said, Brian, it's not just the country you're going, it's transiting, but, support and an appreciation for the really difficult situations people are in.
Okay.
Sorry.
And I think as Diana Ramirez asked, where is this information available? I know there's a lot of good information on the Permits Foundation website. But yes. I think, where else would you say is a good place to find useful data?
Well, it is very difficult. It is difficult to find good data. I mean, I have to say, on the Fragomen website, we also have some good data about which countries accept same-sex marriages, etc. And the Permits Foundation have good data. But I think also I would highly recommend this article by Dr. Quinion from the University of Melbourne, and I'll post it. That's a very interesting read.
Okay, well, we'll get on. And I know Sherry, who's on the show in a moment, also has some data and sources of data, so we'll come back to that. But I do promise everybody out there in the audience, this is not a one-off. We're going to come back to this topic, but at least we've started the conversation. Now, Julia, we're going to say goodbye to you, and I know it's
yes.
It's midnight for you, so let you get to bed. Thank you so much for staying awake for us. And what we're going to do now is bring on Pat, and we're going to switch the conversation, talking about some of the tax implications of LGBTQI expats and working. So without further ado, we're going to bring Pat on. Everybody, you know how it works, and especially as it's so late at night for Julia, hit the heart button, hit the like button, hit the applause button. Let's say a big, big thank you to Julia, and let's welcome to the stage Pat Jurgens. Mr. J, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I stayed up late watching election returns, but
right. Well, that's a whole other conversation that I don't think we will get into today. But certainly that may have ramifications at some point for all sorts of things. But let's focus in on moving with pride and the tax implications, if any, and I'm sure there's plenty.
Oh, maybe a few.
Absolutely. So you've only got a few minutes, but give us some highlights. And as I said, we are definitely going to get back into this in more detail.
Okay, let me start with a trivia question, which I'll answer later. Where and when was the first same-sex marriage issued and registered officially in the United States? So hold that.
Okay, so everyone in the audience, where and when was the first same-sex marriage in the United States? So if people want to answer that whilst you're talking, we'll see, and you'll tell us the answer in a moment.
Okay, great. I have to admit, though, when this topic came up for the show, I really knew very little about it, and so I spent quite a bit of time doing some research and trying to figure out what are the different concerns and considerations, and I put together a quick list of some of the things that I would want to know about, regardless of where you're actually in. The first is whether same-sex couples can legally marry and whether there's any tax breaks available to that couple, whether there's any estate or inheritance tax issues for same-sex couples, whether dependent children of same-sex couples can be qualified tax dependents, and whether they even need to be legally adopted to get that status, and where couples, whether they're legally married or not, where they're owning assets jointly, you could potentially get some issues with gift tax, and same with couples living together and sharing household expenses. Say, for example, are they able to, who gets to claim the mortgage interest deduction? So there's a number of different issues related to that. And interestingly enough, even on same-sex couples that have been married and then decide to get divorced. And so how are alimony and property settlements handled? So there's a lot of issues to be considered there. So I'm most familiar with the same-sex marriage is here in the United States and within Massachusetts. Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriages back in 2004, which was long before it was legally recognized at the federal level. And so there was a point of disconnect where same-sex couples that were married could file joint, but they still had to file separately for federal purposes. So that all changed when a court case that reached the Supreme Court was handed down in 2013. It was called United States versus Windsor. And ironically enough, this case was a tax case, and it had to do with a surviving spouse of a same-sex marriage was denied the estate tax exemption called the marital deduction. And so the ruling paved the way for same-sex couples federal tax benefits, including the ability to file joint tax returns. So there were still issues after Windsor. There were the potential where a marriage was legal in one state, but then the couple moves and that particular state does not recognize it. So say a same-sex couple married in Massachusetts moves to Texas, and then Texas doesn't recognize it. And then they want to get divorced in Texas, and for Texas purposes, they just never were married, so they wouldn't allow a divorce. And so that disconnect changed under a second landmark case in 2015, known as Obergefell versus Hodges. And that ruling primarily was a rights issue. And it basically, the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples under the United States Constitution. So that meant the Texas had to recognize that same-sex marriage, even if that was not what the state law was. So moving on, I noticed within the past week that there was a high-profile same-sex marriage announcement. Miss Argentina had married Miss Puerto Rico. They got married in San Juan. Both Argentina and Puerto Rico recognize same-sex marriages. And if they decide to live in Puerto Rico, they will be allowed to file joint tax returns. They'll have the option to file jointly or separately. I also reached out to a colleague in Germany just to find out what happens in Germany, because I know that only legally married couples can take advantage of a tax break in German tax law known as income splitting. And essentially what that is that you combine the income from both couples, you divide by 2, you calculate the tax, and then multiply times 2. The advantage being that you get to double up on the lower tax rates. And so I've learned that in Germany, same-sex marriages are now legal since 2017, and so they can take advantage of that income splitting rule.
Okay. So Pat, I'm going to move you on. We've got so much in the show, but you did mention that which state was the first state, and I saw answers coming in of Florida, a lot for California. I think the majority, the biggest group were people saying Massachusetts. So put us out of our misery. Tell us.
That may be correct. The first legal marriage was in Massachusetts, but the first marriage license issued and recorded was 40 years before that, 1975, in my hometown of Boulder, Colorado. Nobody
guessed that.
No, of course not. And it was quite controversial at the time, as you can well guess. The county clerk issued 6 same-sex marriage licenses, and then finally the Colorado Attorney General said, no, you can't do more. But those 6 couples were still legally married. So 40 years before it became legal under the Obergefell decision.
Okay, so thank you so much for that, Pat. We've got so much we're going to talk about. We will go back to this subject another time. What we're now going to do is we're going to move on to our producer. We're going to bring Tally onto the show for a moment, and then we're going to be going into the main debate with our very special guest. So everybody, you know how it works. Hit the like button, hit the heart button, hit the applause button. Let's say a big thank you to Pat. And we're going to bring on Tally, who's going to be telling us a little bit about the Top 100 Innovators, which closes later on, well, next week. So we're pretty much coming up to the deadline if you want to nominate somebody. Just a reminder. Hey, Tally, welcome back from your holiday. So tell us a little bit. I'm going to keep it very short today because we've got so much to talk about, but tell us what's news.
So yes, I really want people to nominate, and we got some amazing entries. And again, I want to repeat, it doesn't have to be big. We're nominating for people for automating the immigration process, for supporting global mobility and adapting to the changing business landscape, for sparkling with enthusiasm. So these are beautiful nominations, and really, it doesn't have to be big. And you have 1 more week to go ahead and nominate. Also, I want to remind everyone that tomorrow, Beth Nielsen will be at the GME Live, and you can.
I'll be there too. Best session, but I'll be in the audience. So if there, do stop by and say hello.
Please do. And if you're not in London, or if you are, because later in the day, it's going to be actually towards the evening in London, but in the morning in the US, we're going to have the first part of our mobility masterclass. And that's going to be a brilliant event, and you can still register. It's going to happen tomorrow, and that's going to be the first part. So I really, really recommend people to register and join that masterclass. And okay. Yeah, we have big subject waiting for us.
Okay, let's get straight on to it. Tally, always great to see you. Now we're going to bring people on. We've got 3 guests. We did have a 4th, but sadly, one of our guests can't be with us today because his husband has got COVID, and he's busy looking after their young child at the moment, so can't be there. But anyway, without further ado, let's bring on the guests. And we've got, as I said, such a huge discussion. Hey everybody, so great to have you on the show. As I said, one of our guests, Chris Wilde from Bloomberg, sadly can't be with us because of COVID, but we have an amazing group of professionals. We've got Caroline, we've got Sherry, and we've got Guy. Now, all 3 of you, I'll ask you to say a bit about yourself, but I know all 3 of you are married and at various stages in terms of children as well. So maybe start with you, Caroline. Just tell us a bit about yourself and your company and your personal circumstances.
Sure. Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show, Brian. So my name's Caroline. I'm VP of Product Customer Success at AltoVita. So AltoVita is a tech-enabled temporary housing provider for the mobility sector.
We'll come on to it, but obviously accommodation is a huge issue for same-sex travelers.
Exactly. So yeah, so I'm seeing it from the accommodation side of things. And then personally, I'm married to, in a same-sex relationship. I am married and also have a 9-month-old baby as well with my wife. And we went through fertility treatment last year. And so that's sort of from my personal experience, can talk to that.
And that's many congratulations to you and it's baby Felix, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Yeah. Amazing.
Oh, the memory is very good. Sherry, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so thank you for having me on the show. So my name is Sherry Said, but I'm Sherry to everyone. I'm currently working at Amazon, and my experience is focused on immigration. So I'm an immigration lawyer, and I am also married to a woman who I think is in the audience, by the way. And
what's her name? What's your name?
Carolina. I'm not sure if she has joined already.
Shout out to Carolina.
Thank you. So I'm married as well, and we're actually going now through research on fertility treatment. So that's something that I can speak about. And in the past 3 years, I've done a lot of LGBTQA plus volunteering and pro bono, and it's focused on the European Union. But I think that we will all be surprised about all of the challenges and issues that even in the European Union we have.
I certainly want to get into that because I think there's a lot of assumptions that challenging locations from the LGBTQ position of places in the Middle East and Africa, but actually there's lots of problems within Europe and maybe in Latin America too. But Guy, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for having me. Guy Smith. I am currently working with the law firm DLA Piper. But have been in the mobility industry for rather over 20 years in various in-house and consulting roles.
You don't look it.
Too kind. I live with my husband, and we've been together over 20 years as well. He's from Ireland. I haven't managed to get a EU passport through him yet, but that's not due to us being same-sex. It's just having to live in Dublin for 2 years, which we can't manage. But yeah, so that's me. We don't have children. I have a cat who's quietly asleep in the corner for now, at least, anyway.
Okay, well, I'm not sure we're going to be getting into expat cats, but maybe that's a whole another show we need to do. But actually, I mean, when we started publicising this show, I did a LinkedIn poll. I'd be interested in what people say. I asked, how well do you understand the legal and cultural challenges facing same-sex couples and their dependents when working cross-border? And I gave people 3 options. I said, not well enough, reasonably well, or I'm up to speed. So out there in the audience, I'll be interested in your views. How well do you think you understand the issues that are facing same-sex couples and their dependents when working cross-border? So do shoot out your answers and we'll try and bring some of those up on screen. But whilst we do, I mean, another statistic that came out that we've talked about here, I've got this here, is there are 195 countries in the world, and how many recognise same-sex marriage? And the answer to that is only 33. So there's a lot of countries out there that don't recognise same-sex marriage, and these are really important. So actually, I'll start with you, Sherry. You talked about the fact, and thank you for sharing, that you're looking at fertility treatment at the moment. Now, you're Spanish, your wife is Spanish, okay? Yeah. But in terms of fertility treatment, are there limits in terms of the countries that you can go to? I mean, tell me just a bit about that, because I know you're not an assignee as such, but you are foreign nationals living, you're two Spanish ladies living in the UK. So tell me a bit about some of the issues regarding fertility treatment cross-border.
Yeah, so I consider myself a quite lucky individual because of my European Union passport and because of living in the UK, which is a very advanced country. So both in the UK and in Spain, we can do fertility treatments. But actually, even in these countries, it's different. So for example, in Spain, you need to be married to be able to do a fertility treatment. They won't accept civil partnerships or unmarried couples. Whilst in the UK, if you say that you want to do a fertility treatment with another woman, there is absolutely no restriction. So they're very, very liberal here. But we actually looked a bit into different countries, donor regulations and their requirements. And I was surprised to know that in the majority of the European Union countries, either they don't accept you for being in a same-sex relationship, or they don't accept you for being in a same-sex relationship married. So I have, like, for example, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, all of these countries won't even allow you to take a fertility treatment. In Greece, for example, you can take
when you say all those countries, let's just expand. That would include Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia,
all Eastern European countries that do not have same-sex marriage. The majority of them do not have civil partnership, and because there's a European Union court case from, I think it's 2.5 years ago, by which they should technically accept them. They are forced to accept them by the European court, and they still don't do it, unfortunately. So in practice, we don't have rights to get married or to have recognition, and that also affects fertility treatments. In Greece, for example, which is very interesting, I could actually go and have a fertility treatment if I am unmarried and if I say that it's only my child, and then get married, and then the kid would be both of us. But if I go as a married person, they would refuse it directly.
Okay. And we'll get into that a bit more, because the whole question of kids, because I know how important that issue is. But let's just stick on this whole question of marriage. I'll stick with you, Caroline, because I know you're married. You got married in the UK, so it's quite straightforward. But a lot of couples these days think, oh, we're going to get married. Let's get married in some sunny resort location. And that was something that you looked at, didn't? And you found it actually quite difficult in terms of locations where you could get married. So unlike, a straight relationship, a same-sex relationship, some of the destinations go out of hand too. So tell us a bit about your experience when you were looking to get married.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just talking about this before, where when I was first engaged, and you start looking at, what wedding are we going to have, and you do the Googling different things, thinking, destination wedding would be great. But I'm so privileged that I am living in such a liberal country that is just my mind didn't even go to, actually that's not really open for me. So when you look at even kind of countries that are close to home. So I think Italy was one of them. Oh, well, yeah, no, that's not an option. Even France, I think, was it's difficult in France to get married when you're not French. But there's certain countries where, yeah, it's not, you can't just come in and get married. I think Iceland was one of the best ones, but in terms of same-sex marriage. But yeah, it definitely, things are a lot easier. We're very lucky in the UK, just what Sherry was saying for the fertility treatment, very liberal, and also same-sex marriage, but it's definitely not open everywhere.
There's things like the great ABBA wedding, the Mamma Mia wedding on some Greek island. That's not going to happen.
No, I don't think so. And then, yeah, just like with anything, it's just then your comfort level, you don't know, the legal, I think we were talking before a lot about that, the two levels. There's the sort of legal bureaucratic level of what's allowed, and then there's the social cultural level of what do I feel comfortable with, what do people around me, how do they make me feel? Yeah.
Okay. So. And let's just bring Guy into the conversation. So Guy, I want to go earlier in your life, because you went on assignment as a young man I think you said you were 24, when you went to Singapore at a time when you weren't out. So you went, if you like, under the radar. So tell us a bit about what it's like going on assignment when you're not out either in your, presumably not out in your work life, even if you are out in your personal life.
Yeah, at that time in my life, I wasn't out sort of to family and friends or at work, and being single at the time makes it arguably easier to sort of travel and make those decisions. I think when people are in relationships, some of that can be a lot harder. And I had another colleague who was in Asia, who was out to friends and family, but not to work. And I think one of the decisions people make when they take assignments, is to understand, we talked a lot about immigration, legality, all the rest of it, but there's also the sort of the cultural acceptance. And, I think people will have nervousness in certain countries, even if they on the surface, as sort of Caroline was saying, seem very accepting. Well, actually, what are the genuine sort of views of sort of some individuals? And actually, are you going to get on in your career by being out? And certainly in my early life, obviously I hadn't come to being out to sort of family and friends at the time, but certainly, you do have it in your mind whether that will affect your career in any way, and so I think people will make decisions on whether to share that with colleagues. And I guess going to a new country, it's interesting, being a gay person, every time you take a new job, you effectively come out again, which sometimes you use sort of neutral sort of nouns and what have you, and you sort of, you avoid using him, her, or whatever else it might be, because you don't want to. And I remember I joined one organisation. It was only when my husband broke his leg in 3 places skiing, and I said, I've got to take him to the hospital. My boss spoke to a colleague and said, did he say him? And that's sort of the way it came out, so it's a funny sort of thing. But, that was just moving to another office in London. But I think when you go to another country, and someone like Singapore, particularly being young and you're perhaps not as confident in your own skin, you do kind of put up barriers. And I think that creates actually probably challenges in terms of how much you integrate and how much you are successful in that assignment as well, potentially.
Absolutely. And I think there was a comment actually I want to bring into the conversation. I think it was Damien. Hi there to Damien. He said Italy is the only founding member of the EU that does not have marriage equality. And Sherry, is that something that you've looked into?
Yeah, I think he's right, but I want to differentiate between having marriage equality and actually in practice enjoying that marriage equality. And I want to mention, because in 2020, I moved for 18 months. And what I'm going to say is one of the main reasons why I came back to the UK. But I moved to Belgium, and Belgium is one of the founding members. It does have marriage equality from, I think, 2004 as well, so a very long time. But actually, when you live there and you start looking into the practicalities, it's very, very different. So I started doing pro bono and volunteering with a few LGBT associations, and they had a lot of problems because the country, like Belgium authorities, are not using the same legislation for nationals, like Belgian nationals, than for other EU nationals and non-EU nationals, which resulted in people that had totally valid marriages not having their children recognized, not having their tax or social security benefits recognized. And it even got cases with people with children being declared orphans by the Belgian authorities when they had perfectly valid legal marriages and birth certificates. So I just want to mention that even though we can see from the outside, like, yeah, perfect marriage equality, all rights recognized, it may not be the case when you start looking into it, really.
Well, let's go into this issue with Belgium. I'm sure Belgium's not the only, we're picking on Belgium.
Yeah.
And sorry, if you're from Belgium out there, we apologize, okay? But
Nothing personal.
Let's use Belgium as an example. I mean, Belgium is not just an EU country. In many ways, it's the epicenter of the EU. You couldn't get more EU-ish, if that's even a word, than Belgium.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that if you are married in, let's say, I don't know, United States or somewhere, and you come to Belgium and you've got a kid, just talk through some of the issues that you face getting that marriage recognized, either as a gay marriage or a lesbian marriage, because I appreciate the rules can be different when there's, for example, 2 women on the birth certificate of the child or 2 men on the birth certificate of the child. But talk us through some of the issues that you'd face in a country like Belgium that people wouldn't normally expect to be a problem.
Yeah, so in my particular case, what happened was that I was not married at the time, and my partner was basically not recognized any rights because they did not consider, my relocation package did not consider my partner. So they only recognize certain things if you're married, which for many people is not a possibility, right? Because they cannot get married in their home country. And what really interested me, that was like some cases that I was working on, or some friends even that I have, was that the local administrative authorities in Belgium, and I think this also happens in France and other European countries, have a lot of power of decision. So what they were doing, at least in Brussels, was looking at the origin of these people. So if in your country of origin, your marriage, like same-sex marriage, is not recognized, even if you had a valid same-sex marriage in Belgium and a birth certificate in Belgium with both parents, they would not put both parents, saying that, well, Italy or Greece or whichever country you were coming from does not recognize that, so I'm not going to give you these rights, even if you're a legal resident in Belgium, which for one of my friends resulted in their kid being declared as an orphan and them having to go to court for 2.5 years. And
because they're an orphan because there wasn't a man and a woman on the birth certificate.
Yes, exactly. So they were saying your birth certificate for your kid has 2 fathers and your marriage certificate has 2 fathers, and you're coming from Italy and Cyprus and we're not recognizing that. So that Italy and Cyprus will not recognize this document, therefore we're not doing it. And that's completely illegal because they need to look at the legislation of the place where you are, not the legislation of your home country.
Do they recognize neither of the fathers, or do they recognize the biological father? I mean, how does that?
So because they were asked who's the biological father, and they refused to say, because you have a right not to say, both parents are the same. So in this case, they decided to put them as an orphan because they refused to confirm which one was the biological one. In other cases, if they accept to say, well, I'm the biological one given the genes, then they would just put that person. But my friend obviously refused, and I think he's right to refuse because actually both of them are the fathers.
Yeah, and then I suppose there's a catch-22 in there, because I suppose one solution might be to adopt the child, but how can you adopt your own child?
Exactly. So it was not possible to adopt their own child because they were already both of them there. And for women, it's the exact same thing. So what many people in Belgium were doing was actually go to Spain or to other countries to give birth to avoid this situation, which I think that when you're 8 months pregnant, is not something that you want to be looking into.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, we're talking huge issues here. And of course, that in a way is when it's simple, but there's the other thing that gets complicated is what happens if you get ill and you're on assignment and your husband or your wife, in the same sex relationship isn't recognized, but you need to be looked after, or heaven forbid, the child needs to be looked after. I mean, would the child be taken into care if the child isn't recognized? I mean, what would happen let's say you've got two men with a child on assignment somewhere in, let's pick Belgium or Greece or somewhere. I'm trying to keep to sort of, major countries, not sort of African, Middle East countries where we know there's a bigger problem. But let's say a parent was ill and couldn't look after the child. Would the other parent be able to sort of have next of kin rights, or would that be a problem too?
I'm not sure if anyone else, like maybe Guy, has something to add, but from a legal perspective, they could actually be refused to be let into the hospital because they don't have any way of proving their next of kin according to that legislation. And
Guy, is that something you've had problems with in practice with any of your assignees?
Thankfully not in terms of sort of illness, but I think what it does highlight is a need for people. Look, anyone going on an assignment needs to get the facts about the country they're going to, but I think obviously for sort of LGBT assignees and potentially other sort of minorities and things like that, that getting the right facts for them is very important, because a country might seem accepting, but as we've highlighted here, that's great on the surface, but when it then gets to a practical issue such as like a hospital and the law steps in and the state steps in, no matter what the culture of the country is, no matter what the support of the employer might be, their hands are probably tied in these circumstances. So I think what it does highlight is actually how do we get that key information to people. And I saw a survey actually, which admittedly was 4 or 5 years old, which sort of said 3/4 of cultural awareness training companies don't include the topic of sort of LBGTQ travelers within their sort of guidance. And again, it'd be very interesting to people on the call in terms of sort of if there are any sort of cultural awareness people or destination guides or even sort of relocation and destination services companies, whether this is something that is included, because it shouldn't be.
Let's throw that out for the audience. So all audience out there, whether you're on the relocation management side, mobility manager side, do you, as a matter of standard, have something in the guides that you provide people that give them advice for LGBT travelers or assignees? Is that something that is flagged? Caroline, I want to bring you into the conversation a bit from an accommodation point of view, because that can be, in many ways, one of the first places where issues arise. It may well be that couples going on assignment are entitled to a 1-bedroom apartment, and we're talking about serviced accommodation. We're talking about the first 30, 60 days or whatever of the move. But do you then have people coming to you and say, well, actually, we're a same-sex couple, and will we be able to have a 1-bedroom apartment in the country we're going to, or will there be either legal, cultural reasons why it might be difficult where we're going? Is that an issue that comes up in practice?
Yeah, I think so. There's as you said, the temporary housing is so important with the move because it is that first, it is your home for the first 30, 60, sometimes 90 days. And it's the place that you want to feel comfortable, want to feel safe. So yeah, definitely the thing I thought was interesting, we had somebody recently who said to us after a few days, I don't feel comfortable here, I want to move. And they weren't feeling comfortable in the community. The community, it wasn't in a country that it had been flagged as a legal issue, a social issue, cultural issue. This was actually somebody that was staying in Chicago. So it could be from anywhere. And it just happened. Chicago, literally. And it was
so we're not talking Hicksville.
No, absolutely. But I think it just highlights that, you can, it can be a really, you really don't know all the prep and the social training, everything else that comes beforehand. It really only takes one or two glances, looks, comments that then just completely make you feel unsafe or uncomfortable in where you're supposed to feel the most comfortable. And it changes that relocation to a bad experience. So yeah, definitely something that's really important for the temporary housing part.
And that could be at every level of the organisation. I remember reading an interview with a man called Lord John Brown, who some of you may have heard of. He was the CEO at BP, which is obviously one of the largest companies in the world. And he was not out for many, many years as he climbed the ladder of BP. He was actually second generation BP. His father worked for BP too. And he climbed the career ladder to get to the very, very top of the organization. And it was only in, I think, 2007 that he was actually outed by newspapers. And there was a whole scandal around it because he'd lied to various places. But the important thing was he said he ran his whole career hidden and in fear. So, I mean, and that's at the CEO level. And he was the first openly gay CEO of a major company, I think, anywhere in the world. And that was only a few years ago. I did ask a question right at the beginning. I asked the question, how well do you understand the legal and cultural challenges facing same-sex couples? And many of you answered, but just to let you know, we did a survey on this. And in fact, only 11% said that they felt up to speed. And my guess is that if I ask people again now, probably that number would go down because this is such a difficult, complex subject at every level. There is actually another level I do want to get into, and maybe I'll start with you first, Guy, if I may. And that is the whole question of duty of care. Because we are sitting here as mobility professionals, and normally, in my experience, the relocation people tend to be about the last people to know that someone is going on assignment. The line sort of decides that, you know, that Joe is going on assignment to wherever, Tokyo or wherever. I chose Joe carefully, being it's a he or she name. That wherever Joe is going, you know, you may be the last people to know. But at some point, you need to have that conversation or just find out what's going on. You know, is there an issue, a same-sex issue you need to address? So, Guy, from your point of view, when you've got people moving on assignment, and obviously you've got a duty of care as well, you know, to send people to difficult locations, either difficult from a physical point of view or indeed a mental health point of view, how do you start the conversation?
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to link it back to what your comment just said about Lord Brown at BP, sort of, you know, staying in the shadows in terms of his sexuality, which is all too common. And okay, that's a fairly sort of macho industry, but there was actually an article that came out in a UK publication today, HR Review, which says LGBT plus employees are being prevented from reaching senior management positions, quite often excluded from being presented to clients and things. And the question is actually from an organizational point of view, you know, is there a glass border, if you like, that people make assumptions about gay, lesbian people and their suitability for an assignment? So I think, you know, we've got to look at it from that organizational point of view of actually how do organizations actually not make sort of arguably, you know, unconscious bias or even very conscious bias in decisions about, oh, well, they wouldn't be right or whatever else, because, you know, that is excluding a huge part of the talent pool. You know, and that's obviously.
And is it even legal?
Well, yeah, you know, but then, you know, I think, you know, probably quite hard to prove with a lot of these sort of biases that exist. But that's sort of perhaps tackling that people that are out and all the rest of it. But then, of course, I think the point you're mentioning is people that perhaps aren't out. And I think, you know, one of the challenges is how do you take the approach to ensure that people are allowed to make decisions about assignments and things without necessarily giving the reason. And I think all too often a company, you know, an individual will feel forced into taking an assignment and don't feel they can say no. And, you know, this is one of the reasons. There are plenty of others. But what you don't want to do is sort of find that people don't feel they can say no, or actually almost have to come out to say no. And, you know, when we were talking earlier, we touched on, you know, the first people to know quite often is unlikely to be within the organization, even within Global Mobility. Potentially it would be, but quite often it will be the immigration provider because that's so relevant, or the relocation provider because such things as Caroline's mentioned with sort of housing or other factors. And then I think the challenge actually is arguably less on the Global Mobility people of how to deal with it, but actually as a provider, when the organization is your client and you're sort of privy to this information, how do you handle that sensitively? And I've had cases
where you've got not just duty of care, you've got privacy as well. Yeah. The people might be telling you stuff that their employer doesn't know.
Yeah, and potentially they even become, if you like, a bit of a counsellor to that individual about, well, perhaps you should tell your employer, and actually helping them and all the rest of it. So, you know, they're in a very key point. And I think someone you putting up there, apologies, I didn't catch the name, in terms of someone going to India for one of their first clients, it was the same sex, and they are the ones.
That's Bindu's comment up there, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, there's another comment that comes through I want to pick up on and that's from Yvette. So let's pull that up on screen, and I'll get you, Sherry, to talk about it. But let me just read out what Yvette says. She said, we do include, I'm not sure which company you're with, Yvette, maybe just put that into the comments. We do include legal/immigration filters to start with to understand if the movement is possible. And once the person actually moves, we collaborate with our regional LGBTQ plus communities to ensure they have all knowledge from the local community and have a type of buddy system to help get them the right entry into the country. So, Sherry, I know you're with Amazon now and you've worked for other companies and you're with Fragomen before. So tell us about some of your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, my view is mostly from my experience working with LGBT associations, but I've also seen in some clients when I was working in law firms. I think that what Yvette is mentioning is great. It's much more than what I've seen in the majority of policies from clients in general. But I want to say something that I think is very relevant, that is to understand if the movement is possible. So mentioning what Julia has said, if you're in group 4, in the one that is obviously criminalized, then you have a huge duty of care and you should recommend the person not to go. But if you're in any of the other buckets, including bucket 3, in which you may not be recognized, I think that it's important from an inclusion perspective to have a global mobility program, or try to get to a global mobility program that allows some flexibility. It may be that the person, like your partner, cannot be your dependent, but the individual, the LGBT individual, may still decide that they want to go. And there are some flexibilities that we can give as global mobility professionals if the company decides to do so, such as maybe sponsoring other kinds of visas for the dependent, like study visas or even tourist visas for a shorter period of time, changing the assignment or facilitating going back to the country so the person can still maintain the relationship with their family. There is a lot of, so I don't want to go through you should only send people, LGBT people, to countries in which all their rights are recognized, because that's, as Guy has mentioned, that's going to hamper their careers. There are a lot of things that we can do in terms of being more flexible and ensuring that the talent is properly used and there is career progression for them, even in countries where the legislation is not going to make it easy, especially immigration regulations.
Yeah, so we're getting pretty much towards the top of the hour. It's been the most amazing discussion, and we've scarcely scratched the surface of it. And looking at the comments in there, a lot of engagement from the audience and a lot of people thanking us for putting us on. I saw, I think it was Marissa, and I think Deb Convery made comments that this is such an important subject. It clearly is. And I said, this is our absolute promise. We will return to this very shortly. But let me bring on, I want to bring back Julia and Pat, and indeed, yes, and indeed Tally, our producer. So the gang's back. So Julia, I mean, you've heard a lot about this today. We've only got a few seconds left, but from your point of view, and you're as seasoned a professional as there is in the world in immigration, I mean that in a flattering sense.
He doesn't really. He's just saying I'm very old. Yeah.
Did it open your eyes to whole issues that maybe, haven't been addressed before?
Well, I think it's, it's just really so important when you listen to all of the elements of all of the problems. They're just overwhelming, I think. And I actually just do not think enough attention's being given to this. And I'm really pleased that we did this. We need to do it again, because from an immigration perspective, we've only just covered a few little points. And I think that's the same for all the speakers. We've just covered just a tiny little bit of the subject, and there's so much more that needs to be done.
Well, everybody, you have our promise. We will come back to this subject. I mean, so many things. I mean, one takeaway I got, I think the point that Guy you made is every time you change job, you come out again. And I think somebody put in the comments how exhausting that must be. But I think there's whole sorts of issues there. Anyway, it's been an amazing, amazing conversation. I just wanted to remind everybody out there, you've got 1 week left to nominate people for the top 100 nominators. We've got loads of nominations, but get out there. The website details, it's on the Benivo website, and I know Tally's posted it before. We're going to be back next week, and next week we're going to be talking about improving the employee experience. But to all our guests, many, many thanks, and to our missing guest, Chris Wilde, who couldn't make it today because of COVID. We wish your husband better, and hopefully you don't catch the dreaded lurgy yourself.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody, and we will see you this time next week. Take care.